symposium will be moderated by Professor Baby Shari. The symposium hopes to bring out personal experiences and place it within relevant psychological conceptualizations.
The first to present is Nadira Zahra and Sneha, first year postgraduate students of psychology at Devi College on the topic Life Inside a Social Cocoon. Second, we have Safna, MPhil scholar of Calicut University, to present on the topic Did Disability Remain Invisible During COVID? The third presentation is carried out by Srisha and Aisha, second year postgraduate students of Government Mangada College on the topic Teaching, Learning Zoomed Out. As the fourth presenter, we have Abarna, PhD scholar, University of Calicut, to present on the topic Researching During the Pandemic. The fifth to present is Mubashira Rahman, second year postgraduate student at University of Calicut on the topic Gendered Lens of Pandemic. Sixth and final presentation is by Kavita G. Bhaskaran, PhD scholar, University of Calicut, on the topic Class and Caste of COVID-19 Stories. Now, we call upon Professor Baby Shari to moderate the session.
Hello. As we all know, pandemic had affected almost all spheres of life. And in this particular seminar, we are trying to see the effects on the basis of it, the psychological impact. Specific to this symposium, we are concentrating upon how youth is being affected out of it. Here, the major peculiarity of this symposium is that the youth as such is not being incorporated into the seminar, but here students are being participating, and mainly all the participants are having a background of psychology for their undergraduation and post-graduation. So their views may be having certain kind of peculiarities, but still limiting to their experiences as well as their observation. The participants are trying to bring about how youth life is being affected. Saying youth, it can extend from 20s to 40s and even afterwards. But maybe because of the young blood, the experience may be giving more importance to the emerging adulthood and early adulthood. The varieties of topic include how the youth life or their social aspects, social life is being affected, how far we could extend the experience to differently abled and diversified communities, how academics and teaching is being affected, specific to research process, the impact of pandemic could be viewed, extending to marginalized sector, how gender can be viewed from this impact, and also how far the pandemic stories contain the effect of class and caste. So those are the different kinds of areas that will be covered in this symposium. And we can begin from the social life aspect. This is presented by Ms. Nadira, Ms. Nehra, and Ms. Sneha. They are postgraduate students, but still they are trying to see how the youth life is being affected. The youth in the social cocoon, how they experience. Let us listen to them. Sneha.
Neha, can you please share your screen?
No, I can't see. There is no presentation function.
Now it is opened. Good afternoon. Greetings to one and all present here. I am Nadira Zahra and I have my friend here, Sneha PK. We are first year students studying Master of Psychology at St. Joseph College, Devagiri. And I firstly apologize for not turning on my camera due to some network issues. So, the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted life worldwide. Globally, government have attempted to slow the spread of the disease by promoting social distancing guidelines, including staying at least 6 feet away from anyone outside one's household. Let me start by introducing a fact to those of you who does not know this. So, early in the implementation of social distancing, the World Health Organization (WHO) announced that the term physical distancing better captured the essence of the guidelines, such that people should remain physically but not socially distant from others. When it comes to youth, friends are the most important people in their life. The need for youth to be with friends is perhaps hardwired in brain. When we are with our peers after a stressor lowers our sadness and compared to being alone, and in fact lower sadness compared to being with a family. All of us looks up to our family, parents or siblings largely to meet emotional needs. And here we were inquisitive about how the pandemic has had an impact on social relationship among youth. We conducted a discussion in our classroom based on this, and here I will be sharing our understanding and findings of the discussion. So, this is our topic for the day: impact of COVID on social life and interpersonal relationship among youth, life inside a social cocoon. During the initial stages of the pandemic, most of us had the fear of catching the coronavirus and the uncertainty about the future. That induced stress and anxiety in most people. Then government imposed a lockdown, again social distancing. Can I use the word physical distancing instead? Okay, we as social animals, disconnecting with others can have several repercussions, not just on our emotional well being, but also on our physical well being. What does this mean? A decreased physical proximity. And let me add an important point to it, an important sense: touch, a sense of reassurance and comfort in times of distress. We are all aware that touch increases a sense of bonding or intimacy. Handshakes, hugging, kissing. We would not even have imagined a word like this, not even in our wildest dreams. But COVID has made this a reality. For a couple of months, we had online classes. Although we could see each other virtually, what we felt is not able to be physically present, hugging, sitting packed in bench, holding our hands, lying on each other's shoulders. We felt a lack of warmth, a sort of disconnection, anxiety, and most importantly, feeling of loneliness. So, what we felt, what the youth like us felt, not being able to physically socialize, is given a name scientifically, a term most of us have never heard. touch hunger. Some of our friends bought pets, dogs, and cats to compensate for their feelings of loneliness. Some of them went through social rejections, mental torturings, and abuse as they were stigmatized as corona carriers or corona spreaders. I would say that this happened due to fear of corona infection and fake news, and most importantly, lack of the awareness. And what are the things that the youth has missed? This will definitely be those things you can relate to as well. Our campus life, arts, sports, youth festivals, events, having food together, hanging out, college trips, camps, strikes, gossips, roaming around. Let's not forget about the hostel life. I could go on and on. Due to online classes, we have missed opportunity to mingle with more knowledgeable others, in turn minimizing our skill acquisitions. Usually in classrooms, we share our ideas, emotions, opinions, experiences, perspectives, and critically analyze everything we learn in class. But virtual classes have reduced these kind of interactions. And some of us had dreams to study in central universities. They gave it away in spite of the receiving offers. It is disappointing that those who have already joined them have not even got a chance to visit the campus yet due to the online classes. And do you all miss taking long walks to relax from stress, to free up your thoughts, emotions, and feelings? COVID has created movement restrictions. Subsequently, parents have also created movement restrictions. Under constant vigilance, have in turn created frustrations and disturbances. Most of the youth feel that they do not have a specific space for themselves. A better word to use in the context could be the freedom. The youth feel they have lost the freedom due to this. Specifically, those living in a toxic home environments, the pandemic has worsened the situations. Some of them feel extremely frustrated and others depressed. And one point that struck me during the discussion we had in class is majority of us absorbed in social media platforms, Instagrams, Facebooks, WhatsApp, Snapchat, and every other. Our screen time increased. Social media can be deceptive. I will tell you why. When we see only the joyous or entertaining experiences in friends' life and compare them to our own lesser experiences, we were inviting constant comparisons, inevitably lowering our self esteem and feeling of self worth. Hence, I would say that these social media accounts appear to explicit a vulnerability in human nature. Adding to this, let me tell you how the COVID 19 pandemic has changed the lives of so many young girls. Seeing us girls for long periods time at home, parents started having marriage thoughts. This situation is just apt to get our daughter married. They would have thought. Uncertain future and financial crisis are two words that fit the context as well. When you are at home, feedbacks are received solely from parents and others at home. It is more like an advice. But we, the youth, would want feedbacks from peers. It is inevitable in personal growth. And those in romantic relationship have limited privacy for their communication with their partner, leading to misunderstandings, lack of trust, and relationship conflicts. And what breakups? Usually, when there is a breakup, we got immense support from friends. Because of the pandemic, friends hardly meet, are at home, so they are unable to vent out and share their feelings and emotions. This could lead to depression, loneliness, or even suicidal tendencies. Also, pandemic has decreased job opportunities, unemployment has risen, reduced salaries. All of this has induced anxiety in the youth. It's true that the pandemic has created disturbances in social relationships of the youth. However, let me put forth certain positive aspect to it. Firstly, We have improved our use and knowledge of technology, online shopping, banking, buying food online, and more. COVID gave us a much needed break from routines and schedules. We got time to bring out and work on our creative abilities, explore them, gardening, painting, cooking, music, crafts, so on. And virtual meetups with old friends because we had lots of time in our hand. And staying at home gave us a chance to spend quality time with family and bond with them better. Finally, I concluding that COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted every aspect of our lives. Even before the onset of the crisis, the social and economic integration of young people was an ongoing challenge. Now, unless urgent action is taken, young people are likely to suffer severe and long lasting impacts from the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadira and Sneha. Next, we call upon Safna, MPhil scholar of Calicut University, to present on the topic, Did Disability Remain Invisible During COVID?
My topic is, did disabled persons remain invisible during the pandemic? In this presentation, I will be focusing particularly on my personal experience. First, when there was an outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic in our country, I was not throughout the world, I was in a confidence that it will not affect me. But when university hostels or But when COVID-19 pandemic reached Kerala and university hostels were converted to COVID hospitals, I got anxious, and as I was waiting for my MPhil admission, and I was worried about whether my higher education plans would be affected. When hostels opened and I moved into more outdoor existence, I realized the gravity of change in what people were very comfortable calling the new normal: social distancing, masking, sanitizing. As a disabled Muslim woman, each of these change meant a major adjustment. Let's take a simple example of wearing a mask. Muslim women who wear hijab can easily slide off the mask even with the hijab. Even without the hijab, it would have been a struggle. Social distancing meant that the helpful hands that were around me had some limitations in doing so. And also, first when I reached the hostel, I needed Western toilet and ground floor accommodation. So I was separated from my friend circle in a separate block, and due to due to the restrictions based on the movement of even or non-disabled students, there was a great stress. One silver lining that I saw was the shift towards the online classes and workshops. As a disabled person who cannot travel long distances alone, this was certainly a plus point, but at the expenses of my social circles. Another thing I missed was the physical library, something surfing the internet for long was giving strain, very much strain and distractions. University libraries are a place where I find much solace. Surveys during the pandemic have highlighted the financial plight of disabled people. Under these circumstances, another privilege I see is immense support system from the system that I have from the close-knit family who did not make me aware of their financial hardships. From meeting, they did not face any hardships for meeting livelihood expenses. During the peak of the pandemic, I and family was also affected by coronavirus. Persons with disabilities and their primary caregivers should be given priority for vaccination everywhere. Disabled have been an invisible community, often locked down within the home. Sociologists often call person with disability marginalized of the marginalized, as they would need strong allies who would support the cause but not take over. Nothing about us without us. Making allies was tough even during the pre-pandemic era, but in the post-pandemic era it became even more difficult. When the world was becoming increasingly cautious about their bodies and they stepped into public spaces, taking along a disabled body is not a small responsibility. The disabled community was further becoming invisible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Safna. For the next presentation, we have Srisha and Aisha, second year postgraduate students of Government Mangada College, on the topic Teaching Learning Zoomed Out. Yes.
Let's wait for the screen to be shared.
Sorry, Srisha and Aisha, you're not audible. Can you just raise the voice, the volume of your mobile phone?
Hello? Hello. So we are waiting for the screen to be shared. Am I audible? Hello?
Yes, yes.
Sorry for the inconvenience. Hello. Sorry for the inconvenience. Good afternoon, everybody. Teaching learning zoomed out. COVID-19 pandemic has thrown everyone's life into disarray and irreparable damage to many systems all across the globe. There are real lives within. Health, education, finance, everything suffered. The severity of the effect varies from sector to sector. There are few sectors that have been affected the hardest, especially that required high level of contact and interaction among people. One among them was the education. The true extent of the impact of COVID pandemic is yet to be measured, but all indications show that it will be severe since many children are unable to attend the school and many were facing the constraints of online education. If we miss one chapter at the basic level, we find it difficult to understand the advanced level. What will happen to a batch or a class of students left behind with inadequate access to education for a longer period? You and me are the privileged and lucky. We have our laptops and mobile phones. So we don't have our offline education. We have the choice of online education. In March 2020, schools and colleges in almost all parts of the world were forced to close their doors due to the emergence of COVID-19 pandemic. The academic calendar was severely disrupted with actual classrooms learning being replaced by online learning. Despite this, despite this rapid transition to e-learning, many children have been left without adequate access to education. Online education requires infrastructure that is very costly. An average mobile phone costs 10,000 and data plan costs around 300 per month. And don't even think of Wi-Fi or laptop. 90% of Indian population can't access this. And the digital divide became prominent in the education sector. According to the National Sample Survey report of 2017, just 6% of rural households and 25% of urban households had access to a computer, and 70% of rural and 42% of urban households had access to internet facilities. Definitely, data-enabled cell phones have increased access in the last 4 years. But many of the most disadvantaged people are still suffering, especially in rural areas. Inadequate skill to use technology also act as a barrier. According to the survey conducted by NCRT, 27 to 60% of students were unable to participate in the online classes due to a variety of factors, including a lack of devices, shared devices, and the inability to purchase data packs and lack of technical skills. Study equipments designed for persons with disabilities were mostly available at the learning centers, which became inaccessible when the institutions were shut during lockdown. The needs of the marginalized population were also not addressed. There is a chance that many will drop out from the system after the pandemic unless affirmative and immediate actions are being taken. Most likely, the increased economic insecurity, lack of social protection, the reduced household income will push such children from poorer households to contribute to the family income, leaving their education aside. When 60% of students are not able to participate in the online education, it's actually absurd to discuss about the benefits and limitation of online education. Teachers are not just the information providers. Classes progress. Hello? Am I audible? Is there any problem?
Hello? Yes, you are audible.
Okay. Okay. Classes progress with interactions, listening, questioning, critical comments, the verbal and non-verbal feedbacks from students. It has to be an interactive intellectual discourse that has to happen at higher education. They have the responsibility to shape the perspectives, attitudes, ethics, and values in the thoughts and acts of students. Everyday classroom and off the classroom interactions with teachers, peer groups, the pupil met on the way to school, the nature, the plants, and the animals they meet on the way have a significant role in making a person empathetic, compassionate, social, philosophical, and spiritual. The curricular, co-curricular, and extracurricular activities help a person's overall development. The arts, crafts, sports, exhibitions, celebrations, and the festivals at college, everything got stuck. Online learning shrinks the world of students into a screen within a closed room with overworked heads and lonely minds. Even those who will continue their education once schools reopen may struggle to catch up to their counterparts who have access to online learning. The 2-year gap will make the learning more difficult and less efficient in the coming years for such people, which will eventually make them incompetent for the formal sector job. Despite continuing their education, they may not be able to meet the minimum threshold required for employment in the formal sector, or it may take them considerably large amount of time, and thus will end up working in an informal sector only. Free and compulsory education being a fundamental right, it became costly and inaccessible to many. Even for those who can readily afford online learning facilities, the move was not as smooth as it appears. Online education has entailed a delayed learning process, lack of personalized attention, poor teacher-student relationship, lack of mentoring, procrastination, information overload, attractive distractions, and lack of motivation among students. Apart from this, many people do not possess a healthy learning environment at home. For many female students, education became secondary. They had to involve in caretaking and domestic roles. A peaceful study area is a luxury for many. We don't even understand how privileged we are. For instance, in 2017-19, 25% of Indians were living in a single room. How can a student learn when 2 or 4 adults occupy a single room? We handled this pandemic with utmost incompetence ever. Teachers were not prepared for the shift from offline to online. There was no uniformity in the usage of online classrooms, and many software applications were used at a time by different teachers, and the students has to get well versed with all of them and has to carry all of them with the limited data available. Work from home situations demanded the teachers, especially females, had to multitask. Many teachers lost their job too. The movement in search of better opportunities for higher education also were restricted. However, it is to note that not all the factors that may contribute to low level of human development are created by the pandemic. Most of them were pre-existing and have been exposed or amplified it. In India, online education has come at the cost of marginal productivity loss, which would eventually be revealed with time, while leaving a catastrophic impact on the country's human capital. The people with access to online education may have edge over those without access to it, but this batch of pandemic may not be processing the required skill set and efficiency up to their senior batches. The hardest impact of this will be soon on those students who graduated or will graduate from high school between 2019 and 2023, thus calling them a batch of pandemic. Online, if not for COVID pandemic also, would have been one mode of education system without much delay. COVID made the transition faster and inevitable. All India Survey on Higher Education 2019-20 report states that the gross enrollment rate in higher education of students belonging to the eligible age group is just 27.1%. The Swayam portal came into existence much before COVID. It's a program initiated by Government of India and designed to achieve the three cardinal principles of education policy, namely access, equity, and quality. The objective of this effort is to take the best teaching learning resources to all, including the most disadvantaged. Now, to take this possible, the government has to make sure that the required technical equipment and support of best quality accessible to the needy. Online content has the characteristic that it can be reviewed if recorded whenever required, access the content at the comfort of the listener when compared to the offline content. Concluding this discussion, businesses all over the country may find their ways to recover quickly in the upcoming years, recouping all their losses. But the pandemic's impact on India's education sector, with no schooling for 2 years, for a whole generation, for a whole country, may continue to have long-term devastating effects on the country's prospective human capital resources. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Srisha and Aisha. Next, we have Aparna, PhD scholar, University of Calicut, to present on the topic researching during pandemic.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my topic is researching during pandemic. In this session, we are going to discuss how researchers' work changed from the onset of pandemic, how their research output is affected, and several other individual factors associated with pandemic that influence the research process of each researcher. We begin with the question of what is research or what is a research process. Research is a search for knowledge or researching on existing knowledge using scientific and systematic procedures. We all possess the instinct of curiosity, which is the root of all kinds of knowledge. This curiosity or inquisitiveness makes each researcher probe into their research questions and obtain knowledge through discussions, reading, and meeting new people and experts. And as research is an academic activity, it must be carried out mostly in an academic setup, that is, research institutes, which consists of workspace, library, laboratory, co-researchers, and research supervisors. Formal and informal interactions in such place facilitate a researcher to present themselves and their work in front of the world in conferences. We all know how this pandemic has impacted our reality and our years of hard work. Uncertainty and concerns over immediate future was the immediate problem faced by most researchers. Because the moment we enroll as a full-time researcher, we become a lifetime researcher. Reading, thinking, discussing, and reflecting upon the knowledge that comes our way. When the pandemic struck at our doors, we never imagined it would affect our research too. Research is not producing a thesis after 5 years. Rather, it is a process through which a researcher evolves as an individual, a process through which a scientific discovery takes place, and also a process that contributes to the better functioning of the society. When the research institutes were shut down, this process was mostly affected than the outcome. Along with the academic factors, several other individual and social factors also contributed to the stress and anxiety experienced by each researcher. The problem faced by most researchers was a shift of workspace from an academic setup to home, where there are family members who have no idea on research and research process. This shift was a major one because for everyone, a home is not a sweet home. And it is a matter of concern that for few, home is a toxic place where they are both abused mentally and physically. When researchers from different socioeconomic status enroll to universities, we must understand that a majority do not belong to a privileged familial setup. So is the case with our university, where researchers have often shared their concerns over lack of privacy to work as well as to have discussions or casual conversations with supervisors or co-researchers or even friends. There are even cases where they could find no safe place to quarantine. Most found it difficult to talk about such issues. There were some constraints in research and fund allocation too, which affected the progress of our research, and it was quite a lot difficult to depend on family. Closing down of administrative offices further enhanced the financial turmoil. Besides, several research projects ceased the funding and many refused the extension of projects. Age of the researcher and gender acted along with the family and home environment. Lack of like-minded people at hometown to initiate and carry out intellectual discourse definitely hampered well-being of researchers. As researchers spend most of their time in the research institute rather than hometown, this enhanced a gap between neighborhood friends and the researcher. Furthermore, the patriarchal question from the society on job and marriage also worried the researchers and resulted in a secluded life. In addition, lack of personal space in family, getting involved in family problems, and compulsion from family to take roles had a much more negative impact on the mental health. Due to such reason, researchers found it very difficult to work from home as they experienced continuous intrusion from family members. As we know that a normal academic life and research life is entirely different. We researchers cannot work well when we are told, okay, now you have 2 hours, you may read or work. We need to think, feel, act, and reflect upon the materials in order to reach integration. These connections can only be induced in a private and academically stimulating environment. Thus, the researchers faced a big question mark when returned to the research institute after 1.5 years of break and found it very difficult to restart the research work. At times, when researchers confronted their immediate family regarding their need for space and time, they were silenced, being questioned about having 5 years for doing research. In reality, we researchers are in constant doubt regarding the given time period and our construction of knowledge. Who would understand such dilemmas apart from an academic community? Another common question faced by the researchers is, why don't you just write the thesis and get done with it? This poses another question. Which is important, the thesis or the researcher? Definitely it is the researcher. Thesis is only the product that we can see. But the development and evolution of a researcher as an individual is the result of constant interaction with the scientific community, research participants, books, and discussions. Then, considering the researchers from science department who are in need of a laboratory setup to conduct research had trouble to carry over their research work due to the closure of research institute. They had to start from the beginning after reopening, as they lost the timely observations of the samples that they had bought for a huge amount of money. Gender is another relevant aspect to be discussed in this context. Female researchers found it really hard to handle the research work as well as the house chores and childcare. Female researchers who are married and having children spend more time engaging in house chore activities and taking care of children and in-law parents. The feeling of guilt for not spending much time with the family also contributes to dedicating more time, which can always be thought as being induced by a patriarchal society. Unplanned pregnancy has further resulted in taking a break from research, at least for a few. On the other hand, the magnitude of conflicts experienced by a homosexual or transgender has an entirely different dimension to the aforementioned. Unexpected and sudden change of environment from where they are accepted, affiliated, and empowered, a space they have envisaged for themselves, to a place where they have always been scrutinized for their identity and self-expression, often results in self-doubt and helplessness. The inability to move away from such places due to COVID-19 restrictions can also exacerbate the trauma they have been undergoing. Having faced such problems, however, the introduction of online platforms made the life of researchers comparatively better. Even though the central library of this university offered a better access to the existing e-resources, their utility and accessibility differed on the basis of the caste, class, financial status, family environment, and geographical locality of the researcher. When we look into the empirical evidence on the impact of pandemic on researchers, we can see that it is no different from the personal experiences shared by the researchers in this university, or can be said universal. The evidences suggest that requiring researchers to work from home disrupted their academic activities, resulted in sharp decline in the working hours of researchers in all fields of study. Laboratory-based studies were especially affected due to the containment measures because such studies rely mostly on physical laboratories and time-sensitive experiments. For example, studies conducted in biochemistry, biological sciences, chemistry, physics, and biotechnology, etc. Research studies requiring field visits, observations, and face-to-face interviews also face trouble gathering data. Among the researchers, female researchers reported larger declines in their working time than male researchers. A drop in the working hours, in turn, negatively reflected in the productivity and efficiency of the researchers, like decline in publication of papers and thesis submission. A researcher's productivity is jointly determined by his or her available time for research and research efficiency. And conducting a scientific research work requires hours of quiet and interruption-free environment. The full closure of research institutes greatly affected the working condition of the researchers, where they faced various difficulties in terms of working from home, preparing materials, designing assessment methods, ensuring integrity in research conduct, and also experienced high family strain. Working from home made it difficult to discuss research topics with peers, which reduced the positive influence of peers in motivating researchers, inspiring research ideas, and improving efficiency. Researchers also encountered a heavier workload from increased housework and thus experienced fatigue. Home duties and urgency that required researchers' immediate attention forced them to deviate from their task sequences, which also in turn reduced the research efficiency. Given the unequal distributions of domestic duties, the pandemic has burdened female researchers with more home-related tasks, leaving them less time to dedicate to research. Studies indicate that having a dependent less than 5 years is associated with 15.8% decline in research time, and having multiple dependents is associated with an additional 4.5% decline. Women's investment of majority of time to domestic duties, childcare, and other household responsibilities resulted in less productivity in research. As a result of the pandemic, female researchers are more likely to engage in excessive multitasking between research and home-related tasks, where the limited cognitive capacity is allocated to multiple tasks and thus to have lower efficiency in conducting research. It also induces stress and frustration, making people easily distracted and exhaust their cognitive capacity that eventually drops the research productivity. Apart from family strain, being a natural consequence of the pandemic, stress and anxiety were also recognized as relevant cause of reduced productivity. Other causes include lack of motivation, lack of availability of scholarly articles and research data, and problems faced in research funding. A study conducted among Japanese researchers shows that they suffered from poor mental health with high levels of anxiety and depression. In addition, the researchers also faced certain challenges, such as lack of informal contact with co-researchers, as mentioned earlier, and they also found it difficult to find participants for their studies due to COVID-19 restrictions, and many external participants also tended to withdraw from the research. Putting together the empirical evidences as well as the personal experience of the researchers of this university, we can say that the researchers are trapped in a vicious cycle of reduced productivity, increased workload, and pressure felt to progress. We also need to understand that research is not something that can be done in a snap. It requires high amount of cognitive, emotional, physical, and psychological investment from the part of the researcher. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aparna. Next we have Mubashira Rahman, second year postgraduate student at University of Calicut, to present on the topic Gendered Lens of Pandemic. Mubashira, the screen is all yours.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, Mubashira, you're perfectly audible.
Please give me the access of presence.
Mubashira, you can start your presentation.
Okay, 1 second.
Mubashira, you can also proceed without the PPT.
Hello, am I audible right now?
Yes, you're audible.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Myself, Mubashira Rahman, pursuing my post-graduation in Applied Psychology, University of Calicut. It's my privilege and immense pleasure to be here to discuss about the gendered lens of COVID-19 pandemic in India. The gender effects of COVID-19 are very complex and extend much beyond the issues of care work and domestic violence that have captured global attention. The onset of the global COVID-19 pandemic put a halt to progress towards gender equality and instead exacerbated existing gender inequalities across the domains. Some effects have been immediate, such as education, job losses, food shortages, and enhanced domestic work burdens. Others will emerge in time, such as mental health depletion, savings and assets, pandemic related issues, marriage, widowhood, parenting, etc., which would make recovery very difficult. I use examples from India to outline the complexity of such outcomes. The global focus of the gendered impact of COVID-19 has been largely on two issues: domestic violence and care work. Both issues are clearly important, but they do not cover the full range of gendered fallouts and their implications. Beyond the visible and short-term impact of the pandemic lie longer-term implications for the many who are unable to recover economically, socially, or emotionally. Implications that are likely to play out differently for women, men, LGBTQIA+, economic groups. In fact, even the much discussed rise in domestic violence is complex and it is catalyzed by multiple factors. Some are hidden, such as social norms and intra-household power relations, and other are visible, such as women's poverty ownership, job losses under the pandemic. And I use examples from India, especially the Malabar regions of the Kerala. I share reflections on the complexity of the outcomes. As a gender is a very wide area to cover, I can only provide an overview of some of the most glaring gender topics. First of all, I would like to discuss about the health and well-being. The COVID-19 pandemic has also put women's physical and reproductive health in jeopardy. I have faced during the pandemic, that during the first lockdown, I feel very shame and guilt. Also, my mother, who is a menstruating woman, felt very shame and guilt for writing our basic needs, basic sanitary needs in the list, in the grocery list. At that time, we know that we only are very important grocery items. So that experience really haunted me during those times. And I shared my experience in WhatsApp status, and many of my friends also share the same experience of the menstrual poverty during pandemic period. As many countries such as India and Nepal reallocated their medical resources to the care of COVID-19 patients, such as service closure, are particularly concerning in countries where unsafe abortions, sexually transmitting diseases, unhealthy reproductive habits are leading cause of physical vulnerabilities and the mental vulnerabilities. The negative effects are likely worsen from those from other marginalized groups such as queer and trans individuals, ethnic minority women, and women in poverty, etc., as these groups are at heightened risk of healthcare marginalization. Next, I would like to describe about the education. When I conducted very informal surveys in between my friends, family members, majority of them reported that they have learned less since beginning of the pandemic, inflicted multiple shocks on young people and affected their mental well-being across all the genders. There are also likely to be second generation gender and class effects. To be very simple, digital gender bias, which is both immediate and the long term. Because of the pandemic, schools have closed globally, often requiring students to learn online, but large number of households in developing countries and states like Kerala lack computers or mobile phones with internet access. In families that have one phone, given gender bias, we would expect priority to be given to the education of boys over the girls. Girls may even drop out of school altogether. Again, although this is more likely in developing countries like India. Also, I would like to mention, no genders have the privilege as cis heterosexual male. So I'm more focusing excluding the same gender. For many families, they feel very proud sending their daughters to higher education, even though it's bare minimum. Lockdown and staying back at home was really a task for girls, as already mentioned by previous presenter. Girls, it's very impossible, or it's really a task for girls to run away from the marriages and other related decisions. Survey conducted by Times of India shows that early marriages are 0 in 2014 and reached 27 during the year 2020. And highest number of marriages were reported from the Wayanad district, I read somewhere. And I can't define what I feel when people reason it as cohabitation culture or tribe culture or whatever it is. Okay, next I would like to share about jobs and livelihoods. It is notable that although employment has been at the center of global media attention, we hear little about the differential job laws by gender and even less about the intersections of gender, caste, and race. In India, as in many developing countries, most young workers are employed in the informal economy or unorganized sectors. Women are at particular risk of losing their livelihoods during the pandemic because they have very fewer employment options and are in lower paid, less secure jobs. Many young women who have gone back from their city jobs to their villages are less likely to return to be hired back. Those seeking to survive with no earnings and few savings will increasingly face poverty and food scarcity. As we all know, during difficult times, selling assets is a coping strategy. If forced to sell assets, families tend to first dispose of smaller items, such as smaller animals, pieces of jewelry, etc. Interestingly, the irony is that the smaller assets are also often the only assets of women owned, whereas the larger assets are usually owned by men. Selling small items appears logical in economic terms, is it? But this sequence of sales can have hidden gender cost. If women lose their assets while men retain theirs, young women's bargaining power within the home is undermined, leaving them more vulnerable. As food scarcity grows, for example, in typical Indian homes, where existing social norms require women and girls to eat last and least, we can anticipate gender inequalities in food sharing and hunger within homes. It is worth considering. It is very important. However, whether this would be case only in developing countries or is it spread globally? In India, for example, many families are facing food scarcity under the pandemic. We might ask, is the impact of the scarcity being borne equally by gender? Similarly, when the household draw on savings, whose savings are being drawn upon? Men's or women's? Even for domestic violence or care work, we can encounter layers of complexity. For example, although it is well recognized, that clustering family members into small spaces under lockdowns could increase the risk of physical and verbal abuse. I observed that it is less recognized that male unemployment can also escalate domestic violence, as found in many of our households itself. The pandemic has also given rise to new forms of control and manipulations. Abusers may fabricate or exploit these quarantine rules to control their partners and prevent access to support. Moreover, out of fear of COVID-19, victims may feel less inclined to seek support from attended hospitals. Women can be affected not only by their own loss of earnings, but also if their husband loses their jobs under COVID-19. Research shows that women who are economically better off are also better placed to connect with helplines through their cell phones if they face violence during the pandemic, whereas poor women, children lacking individual cell phones would remain at high risk. Hence, to assess the impact of the pandemic on domestic violence, we need to move beyond the generalization to a more intersectional approach that takes into account women's class and property status. Okay, we are discussing about the gender inequalities, and what do you think? Why do gender inequalities worsen during the emerging crisis? Number one, my observation is gender role beliefs and expectations. Women, especially those in relationship with men, may be expected to reduce their work time to take over caring duties, which I've already discussed, whereas men, particularly those in relationship with women, are not. Thus, it is no surprise that women report greater stress and anxiety, as the pandemic has both increased the role strain and the expectation put on the woman, as well as reduced external support. And the second important factor is the gender roles, responses to threat, and precarious masculinity. Gender roles offer clear script for how people can or should behave. Consequently, defined gender role expectation can elicit personal, identity, and systematic threat. The reverse is also true. Experiencing threat and strengthen essential beliefs about gender, especially among men. Therefore, in time of the crisis and change, people may justify gender inequalities by believing that women are inherently better suited to perform caring roles, domestic labor, and men discourage women from displaying coldness or stoicism, and men from displaying anxiety or distress because of the fear of appearing too feminine and thereby losing their tennis masculine status or whatever. Increasing violence against women and members of gender minority groups is the result of this one. For instance, staying at home orders meant that women and children were forced to remain in close proximity to their abusers, or we can term it as double pandemic. Finally, one of the most striking issues emerged from the COVID-19 pandemic is lack of consideration of gender and its intersection as critical moderators of health and well-being. In the wake of pandemic, institutions, funding bodies, and community stakeholders may have shifted their attention toward tackling the devastating virus, and in doing so, have seemed to forget the systematic virus that already plagued the society and that in many cases have intensified. For example, less than 1 in 5 COVID-19 policies were very gender sensitive. Moreover, only 37% of the COVID-19 cases reported to the World Health Organization were disaggregated by sex or gender. To conclude, the COVID-19 pandemic has held a magnifying glass to gender inequalities and in doing so has revealed cracks across many domains. One thing abundantly clear, the gender stereotypes roles and the expectation underlying these inequalities are not sustainable and can cause undue harm, especially during the times of crisis. Going forward, social psychologists must do their part by contributing to an understanding of what is needed to the level of gender playing field, while ensuring that the challenge binary conceptualization of gender broaden their focus across the gendered groups and adopt an intersectional lens in the research. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mubashira. Next, Kavita G. Bhaskaran, PhD scholar of University of Calicut, will be presenting on the topic Class and Caste of COVID-19 Stories.
Good afternoon. I think this is going to be an addition to what we heard in the morning session. In this presentation, I am trying to shed some light on how the layers of oppression, privileges, and intersectional power worked in the years of COVID-19 pandemic. As I can't cover every aspect of it, I am trying to focus on how caste and class worked in this situation. Again, I can only showcase a very few of it with my limited knowledge and observation. I am not making any conclusion, but just putting forward some of my observation regarding this issue. I will be doing my presentation around stories that were circulated and listened during the time of pandemic. Stories that were not even told. This is about who has and have the narrative agency. And finally, how the scientific information was taken out of context to add to existing narrations, which in turn contributed to the injustice embedded in the social structure. Let me start with the stories that were told and circulated. It is about the youth who have narrative agency. In the years of COVID-19 pandemic, we had listened to a lot of stories and narration through newspapers, channels, social media, and so on. It included real-life stories of doctors who were doing their duty irrespective of time. We have seen the faces of nurses and other medical professionals which were wounded because of continuous use of masks. We have listened to stories of ambulance drivers, volunteers, people who worked at cremation ground, people who fighted for oxygen cylinders, who were waiting in front of the cremation ground for hours and hours. We have listened to propagandas, news report regarding death, and dead bodies floating over river. We have listened to people who spread hope, stories of fighting back the situation even in the worst realities, and of course, the stories of making dalgona coffee. We have shared some of them, most probably stories that we personally found informative, important, emotionally triggering, and maybe something that helped us to stay positive and keep the fight on. All the stories are important, so as the pain. And it is equally important that our government take these into consideration while planning to deal with the pandemic in any level. And of course, as psychology students, when we think and talk about psychosocial effects of pandemic, this should be our priority. But my question is that enough? These stories were told and listened because the people who hold them were privileged in one sense or in another. Either they were educated, efficient in using technology, has gadgets that help them to access technology. In short, they have access to mainstream. They have the emotional, social, economic, cultural, and historical privilege to stand, face the camera, and speak. Those who shared and circulated these stories definitely belong to the privileged, like most of us. Unfortunately, all debates, discussions, and policies are being formulated based on these told, listened, and circulated stories. There are some other humans who also have stories, intense stories of conflict, ignorance, pain, fight, and hope, but don't have the power to tell them. Most of them belong to some particular caste and class. A few number of such stories were found out by some passionate journalists and NGOs, but those stories, which are less in number, will lack visibility, never got counted, nor do we expect to, when the government planned their strategies to fight back the pandemic based on statistics and grand narratives. It won't be discussed in any social, political, or academic circle until we are willing to listen to the stories of unprivileged people, which demand a lot of effort. Most of them won't be able to understand the importance of telling their stories, nor do they believe that their story matters. And even if they understand, they won't be able to trust you and communicate their stories to you because of the oppression they have been facing to say even before their birth based on their caste and class. According to Divya Roslyn David, the volunteers of the organization PARI reported the experience of poor people from rural areas and people from marginalized caste and communities were pathetic during the pandemic. Thousands of deaths went countless. When we were shouting out about the lack of hospital beds, lack of oxygen cylinders, those people didn't even have a doctor to prescribe a paracetamol. They don't even know what a paracetamol means. They were just beaten up to stand inside a circle that was marked in front of the shop. They don't know why they are standing inside that circle. So, when we talk about the psychological consequence of COVID-19, did we have any idea about what kind of psychological effect they had? Can any of our pandemic special psychological theories be used to understand their psychological state? When we suggest to wash hands regularly, did we have any idea about how many miles a lady need to walk to fetch a vessel of water for her household chores? Did we have any idea about what that extra mile of walk and that extra vessel of water costed? Did we have any idea about what are the physical and psychological effect of it? We don't know how these people conceptualize pandemic. When we tell about anxiety caused by the pandemic, we don't know whether these people were anxious or not. We don't even know the dimensions of their anxiety and fear. Then how are we going to deal with it? Think about the people who were forced to move at the time of sudden lockdown. Most of them had no idea what a pandemic is. All of them were from a particular class. They were doing an action without knowing why they are doing it. How will we match their perception of pandemic with the perception of privileged people who know what a pandemic is and try to deal with it using a plate and spoon? Sudha Bharadwaj, while sharing her experience in jail, was mentioning about unprivileged jail inmates. Legal assistance were withdrawn. They had no idea what was happening outside. Their relatives couldn't pay visit to them, nor do they were getting letter from their dear ones. The inmates, of course, from the marginalized caste and class, were asking to read out the newspaper loud. It may be because they were concerned about their dear ones, as they know their dear ones don't have enough money, power, or education to deal with some sort of tragedy happening out there. They don't even have the capacity to understand what that tragedy is. We were providing free online counselings. It was a great effort. A lot of people were benefited. But there were people who don't know what a counseling is, who didn't even a private space or personal time to sit alone and call for assistance, who didn't even had network coverage, who didn't have a cell phone but still use a coin box, at times not even a coin box. Here we are collecting data about adjustment issues during the pandemic through Google Forms and planning interventions. How can we help them without knowing about them? How can we make theories of counseling and therapy without knowing the structure of their psyche, social circumstances, and the issues of caste and class oppression, which is deep-rooted? When we look at the frontline fighters of COVID-19, we can see this hierarchy of narrative agency. Look at the details of death of health workers. Only the name of the doctors and some nurses were mentioned in all the newses. All the other work in health sector and lost to pandemic were just a number. We don't have any idea about the life of a major sect, a life of people like cleaning staff, people who do laundry, deal with the garbages, who enter into manhole, basic labor workers in cremation ground, and many more. All of them did job to help the survival of the world. All of them were frontline fighters. Did any of us know what happened to their life during and after their services? Why this ignorance is happening? Because our idea of inclusion is already a messed up one. Let us take an immediate example. When we present a paper in any national seminar, we present it in English. Of course, it is necessary to know English in this post-colonial India, as its life is still circulating around the legacy of submission. But did we ever ask our participants about how much they understand English? Can they express themselves in English? Did we ever consider to translate invited speeches to language they prefer? Do we ever make sure that each and every unprivileged student get their share of knowledge and a space in the discourse? No, we never did that. As a result, the knowledge delivered here reached those people who are privileged to have proficiency in one particular language other than his or her mother tongue. So, we are not habituated to the idea of inclusion. In the COVID-19 situation too, we are doing the same. As students, we try to understand the mind and behavior of human. We have to look inside us and should question who are that human we are trying to understand. Also, how much we know about the social, cultural, historical, and political atmosphere and layers of oppression that determine the mind and behavior of that human. All of us are privileged to have narrative agency. It is our responsibility to find that untold stories, bring it out, circulate it, and consider it while we are talking about psychological effects of pandemic. And through that, we can force the authority to look at the marginalized people out there. Stories influence policies, and policies influence stories. Let me move into the last session of my presentation. I would like to present my observation regarding how the scientific information provided during the time of pandemic add to casteist and religious fundamentalist argument that can reinforce and justify social discrimination related to caste and class. Major directions from medical practitioners related to prevention was hygiene and social distancing. These directions were very important to save thousands and thousands of lives. Not so surprisingly, the same information were taken up by casteist and religious fundamentalist group to strengthen their argument related to how social structure and social behavior should be, which is totally dangerous. For example, instructions like wash your hands repeatedly, enter into the house after a bath, practice social distancing, etc. was taken up by casteist and fundamentalist group. They used this information to justify their socially regressive concept of aitam and shuddhi. These sort of arguments were spreading through the social media. The people who wanted to spread these arguments were privileged people who had narrative agency, money, power, and social acceptance. We, the people who is secretly proud about making puttu from Brahmins puttuvadi, were subliminally perceiving these arguments. Knowing or unknowingly, it can sharpen the casteist inside us, and it can be reflected in our attention, perception, cognition, and behavior. So the net effect is like a fibroid is getting bigger and bigger inside our body, benefiting from the food we take to sustain. Maybe we have some obsessive thought and compulsive behavior related to hygiene. The whole scenario of the pandemic was making us more and more anxious. The casteist narration of scientific information came in, and it gave validation to the casteist ideas in us related to untouchability. Our anxiety increases, as so is our obsessive thought and behavior. I think it is important to inquire the chance of this kind of social impact and keep ourselves and others aware about it. Now let's look into the concept of hygiene. The concept of hygiene can be strongly linked to caste and class separation. Who is hygienic? Who have the privilege to be hygienic? Both these questions arises. When we suggest a routine to be hygienic, it may look like a general suggestion which anyone can follow. But actually, the prescribed hygienic behavior is something that is difficult to understand and adapt by people from marginalized communities and lower socio-economical status. There are cultural, social, infrastructural, economic, and mindset-related barriers to practice it. We are prescribing a hygiene routine without studying any of this. Now, who is hygienic? When we search for the answer, we will suddenly find the us and other separation. We perceive us as hygienic. When we talk about us, we will claim that our ancestors were hygienic, our culture teaches that, and today also, being hygienic is a habit to us. What about the other? And who is the other? The unhygienic other is anyone from a marginalized community or lower class. The other is not hygienic. Why? Because we have some stereotype against them. First one is that they don't practice hygienic behavior. When they prove that they practice hygienic behavior, they have to prove that. Anyway, when it is proved, remaining stereotype came into play. They are not clean as a group. They don't have a culture which practice hygienic behavior, etc., etc. So, the other don't become clean even if they wash themselves 1,000 times. Because they are black, they are lower class, they belong to a certain caste and community, they do some particular job for livelihood and so on. Every unprivileged other is considered to be contaminated. Just imagine that you are talking to two ladies. First one is fair, wearing a branded dress, having costly ornaments. And the other lady is brown, wearing an old sari and some glass bangles. Amongst them, towards whom will you look suspiciously? Keep that sudden first answer and think about it. The unprivileged group were the one who got exposed to the pandemic at a level which could not be matched, as they could not afford to stay back at home. Privileged people believe that poor are destined to directly encounter the pandemic. Let the servant go to the shop, you stay safe at home, our Lalatin suggested. Without counting, they probably had more casualties physically, emotionally, academically, socially, in fact, in every aspect of their life. All the privileged classist narrations and stereotypes are again contributing to their suffering. They have no narrative agency to tell their story. So no one considered their issues while building theories, planning interventions and making policies which make their state of life more miserable and less understandable to privileged us. So, social science students like us, who are privileged, not equally privileged, but still privileged, need to understand this kind of layers of oppression and intersectional power so that we can effectively change ourselves and act as an agent of change by spreading awareness about the effect of different narrations around us and by bringing out the impact of COVID-19 in the different strands of society. And I hope one day we can answer with an yes to all questions put forward in the morning section. Thank you.
Thank you, Kavita. It has been a wide range of topics we have heard, and we have only 5 minutes before the next session needs to start. So we call upon Professor Baby Shari to give concluding remarks as briefly as possible. Ma'am.
Due to lack of time, we are not coming to discussion. First of all, all the presentations were very good. Content-wise, in the beginning, I felt like it was lacking certain kinds of aspect, but that could be covered from the other sessions, and that was extending a little bit more than expected in terms of time. But the total content has covered almost all aspects of. We have thought about the life of youth. More than that, this is not a time for question and answers, but the participants were trying to talk from their own experience more and also a little bit about from the studies already have been conducted in this area. So while talking about the social life in general, Sneha and her team was trying to come to the level of social life of youth, pointing out the touch hunger and also the campus life. What is being missed from youth in the campus is they are not talking about the syllabus, not talking about the classroom, but was mentioning about what they really miss. It's nothing but the peer interactions, feedback from them, and how far they can move forward. When there are restrictions in the freedom in terms of social mobility, and parental control happens to be nothing but advice giving, which is not expected from the peers as their real kind of feedback. The romantic relationship was also affected, and they had pointed out about the frustration, anxiety, depression, and how far the self-esteem is being affected out of it. And coming to the presentation by Safa, she was trying to talk about how a differently abled person was unique in terms of many ways. She had pointed out her own experience as a young lady, as a Muslim woman, as a differently abled person, how far hijab and her experiences inside her own self happened to be so easy to deal with the kinds of things like wearing a mask or keeping a social distance, but how far the restrictions have drastically affected her, unlike other people, and which happens to be an open expression of how intersectionality has to be taken into consideration. She pointed out about discrimination and marginalization in many ways and how they is being viewed. The need for assistive technology in university campus and all such things happen to be thought about during her presentation. The same way our department has got community-based disability management system. They are dealing with developmental disability, and we have a wonderful multidisciplinary system to deal with. But during the pandemic, they were trying to develop an online mode of support, and a model was developed out of it, which was accepted by UNESCO as a ideal model. And I was thinking about that in this kind of a situation. And about teaching learning environment, Srisha and her team was coming to a wonderful kind of presentation. But we also have to think about the fact that, you know, after teaching or after your experiences in the university, what we are going to produce out of it. Are you going to produce certificate? Are you going to produce degrees, marks, and things like that? And these certificates will go to the community and will be going to function? No, it will be the people, it will be the students who will be going to the community, to the society, and it will be through your behavior, your attitude, the community is going to get benefit out of education. So, whatever experience that you are going to receive from the campus is important, so that what do you think about gender, what do you think about intersectionality, what do you understand about environment, how do you consider earth, how do you consider water, what do you think about waste management, how will be your behavior dealing with your own waste, how you are going to understand people different from you, who are differently able, who are diversified on the basis of different kinds of culture, how you understand culture, how far you are ready enough to deal with different aspects of culture, how far you know about human rights, how far you can deal with different kinds of contributions of experts into your life, how far you are experienced with different kinds of practices in life. That will be creating a student's attitude, to students' qualities and talents, and that will be expressed through the behavior of each and every student into community. So when we talk about teaching learning situation, it's not simply syllabus, it's not simply the content that is being transacted, but the total curriculum, the sum total of experience a student is going to get from the campus is important. So those things are highly being affected during the pandemic when we are shifting to online education. And she referred it very well as a pandemic batch. So those kinds of aspects also will be there. And Ms. Kavita was talking about, Ms. Aparna was talking about how a researcher during her research is being affected during pandemic. So she had opened up wonderful arena of situations which will be affecting especially as a youth. And she said that not simply a researcher, a Dalit researcher, a homosexual researcher, or a person who coming from a poor background, how they will be affected. They never say that we were sending back home. We were thrown out of the campus, where we are not sure of the fact that where we are going back is a safe environment, a safe a situation which will be providing us some space for the research to happen, some kind of convenience, some kind of time set apart for you is not being provided. And even when that is being compared between boys and girls, the strategies were different. So she was talking from her own experience from the same campus, and that was extended to a wide variety of situations. Moreover, in terms of research, science researcher might have been their own sample, they were brought up for a long time. Social science researchers may not be able to find their own sample and participants interact with, and changes in the research tools where Google Forms were widely used and things like that. And in terms of the gender-based lens to see the pandemic, Ms. Mubashira was trying to see different kinds of aspects. She had referred to digital gender bias, She had pointed out certain drastic situations like unexpected pregnancies and other kinds of things. When we talk about unexpected pregnancy, this is just like, in the case of research, we talk about the product and all. Sometimes the process might have been forgotten. The kind of situation in toxic relationship, marital rape, and sexual interaction are highly being hidden even from the discussions. And the difficulty in unorganized sector from the working class was pointed out, where ladies are highly being affected. We really have to think about the ladies who are sitting home and leading their life and having all the different kinds of oppressions and all. And sometimes we thought like, when we were at home during lockdown, whether we were getting some kind of insights into people who are there at home and will be leading such kinds of oppressed life and all. So gender role belief, patriarchal system and abuses during pandemic, those kinds of things were referred. And she was also trying to extend a little bit about LGBTQAI community, and that was highly being even not referred in our own discussions too. While talking about class and caste, Ms. Kavita was trying to refer to many of the aspects which was not being referred in other presentations, like a lady who has to fetch water after walking for a long time, even traveling kilometers, she may not have the ownership on that water. Even such kinds of people are directly being ignored when we are asked to wash our hand again and again and think about the hygiene and other precautions. So I thought about a mother who had fallen in the hot summer of Delhi, who had been waiting for permission to reach the cremation of her son, a daughter, a young adolescent who had been carrying her father in her bicycle to go more than 120 kilometers, and people who passed away when a train engine hit them when they were sleeping during their long walking journey to their hometown, and people who had suffered in a number of ways. So all those things were thought-provoking stories for us, and she was also trying to bring about different kinds of class and caste layers to read these kinds of issues. Especially coming to the language proficiency also, even in academic discussions on these kinds of matters, we also think about the privileged group only. We are easily forgetting the fact whether how far people are being received, even when we are trying to disclose our ideas, our observations, and using government funds to extend to the society. Are we coming to the majority? No. Sometimes even privileged minority is being dominated over many other kinds of rights. Okay. So with this, I would like to conclude. I would like to congratulate all the participants who had taken part in this symposium. I think people could have a wonderful experience, and of course the rehearsal will be much better experiences than the stage performance. So that I think that the teamwork behind this symposium also worked well. Thank you.
Yes, so our symposium have come to an end. It was indeed a great session, and I'd like to thank all the presenters. And I also thank Professor Baby Shari, who moderated the session. The next distinguished to honor us with her session is Dr. Keerthi Pai on the topic, Orientation to Grief During the Pandemic. Before we begin the session, we will share a few words about Dr. Keerthi Pai.
Dr. Keerthi Pai has done MPhil in Clinical Psychology from KMC Manipal and PhD from Madras University. She is consultant clinical psychologist in Apollo Hospitals, partner in Element Age Psychological Support Services, and guest faculty in Institute of Mental Health, Chennai. Dr. Pai is the Joint Secretary of the TNACP, and mental health advisor for Apollo Shine Foundation. She has received training in marine psychology from Denmark and is involved in psychological assessment and therapy for seafarers in Southeast Asia. She is a certified clinical supervisor from ACA Australia and is also trained in grief therapy by David Kessler, USA, and trauma-focused therapy. She has been resource person in national and international conference and has over 15 publications. Her work experience in psychological assessment and psychotherapy spans more than 2 decades. Please, ma'am.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all of you. I hope I'm audible enough. Can somebody indicate if I'm audible enough?
Ma'am, you're audible. We can hear you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So thank you very much, University of Calicut and Dr. Neetu for inviting me. It's always a great pleasure to interact and talk to young minds about different aspects of psychology, and grief is something which is very dear to me, close to my heart, and I'm indeed, I feel privileged to be part of this conference, to be presenting and talking about grief. So I've been given a time frame of till 4:15. So what I would do is I would take you through different aspects of grief, and then I would definitely want to interact with young minds about your own experiences handling grief during the pandemic. So when we started hearing about pandemic in 2019, we all thought, including me, we all thought that it's going to be a few months or few weeks, but then the few extended to 2 years now, and we are still going on with the pandemic and with different waves coming in and going. So last year, especially 2021, was very difficult because there was a time when we were hearing that we are hearing about people losing lives and people talking about losing their near and dear ones, but 2021 happened to be more and more hearing about people losing their near ones. Personally, I am a grieving person, so 2021 has been really difficult for me, and the grief therapy, which personally I went through, which I got trained, and that is some of the learnings which personally I like to share, because when it comes from a personal point of view, it always hits the nail on the head. So I would also talk to you about certain, if I can say, patients or persons who have gone through grief. And here, where I look at grief is mostly grief where we have lost somebody, loved one. Grief could also be where we try to look at, loss of a job, loss of a house, or loss of employment, loss of a shifting from one country to another country, so things like that. Somebody who is good in technical, can you please help me with the, so with the screen sharing, I hope I'm doing it right. Are you able to see my slideshow?
Yes, ma'am, we can see it.
That's my first slide. Yeah. So what I would be doing in this overview is to, talk to you about different aspects of diagnosis of grief, a little bit on the different stages. If we have time, about the assessments and therapies, and of course I would get into a few case discussions, because it's always interesting to look at how people are coping with different aspects of grief. And here, as I said earlier, we are looking at grief where lost somebody near and dear ones, because I'm sure all of you sitting in the audience and listening to me in the spiritual field may have at least heard or known who has been grieving. So what we look at here is certain points before I go into my presentation. All of us here are professionals and we do have ethical practices, but more on that, we are also human beings. So at any point, if you are recalling or remembering, reminiscing any sad event or something which is making you feel vulnerable, please do take support. Please see to it that you are around somebody, you are in a safe place, and you are there with people whom you trust and you know that can support yourself. Yeah, there is going to be unconditional support of all of us during this whole program. Learning is the only agenda which I have here because that's what we are here for. Confidentiality is the key. Q&A, there are certain aspects which we are discussing. Confidentiality, we are all mental health professionals and we are all looking at respecting and valuing human behavior. Stretch your body if you feel that you are getting stuck in your, please take a break if you feel, there is something worrying you at any point. Okay. As I move ahead, I hope I'm audible enough. A little bit definition about grief. What we are understanding is that grief has a range of emotions. It could be deep sadness. It could also move on to anger, aggression. And the process of adapting to a significant loss can vary from person to person. So just because somebody is able to kick back as fast as possible doesn't mean that the other person also should be able to do that, right? And it depends on a lot of, the belief systems, their
Dr.
background,
Keerthi,
the
can you hear me?
relationship about, yeah, yes, I
Are
can.
you changing the slides because the slides is still on the intro slide?
Right, okay. I have to the next slide.
So maybe if you PowerPoint presentation and then...
I will stop share and I'll go back again. Yeah. So let me do again. So let me share content, window, orientation. Thanks for that. Which slide are you seeing? Are you able to see?
Now we are seeing fifth slide.
Definition?
Fifth one.
Yeah, grief definition.
Grief definition, yes. So I was telling you about grief, the definition of grief. So it is a reaction to any form of loss, and there is a huge range of feelings from deep sadness to anger. And of course, it changes from person to person. So you may have seen people kicking back, coming back into, in quotes, the normal behaviors which we would expect. But there are also people who would still be grieving. And in my practice, I'm seeing people who are coming in because they know I do grief therapy, and people who have lost their near and dear ones about 8 years, 15 years, more, less, things like that. So people who have lost their near and dear ones because of COVID and otherwise. So here, especially during the presentation, I would talk more about people who have lost their near and dear ones because of COVID, because that's a huge amount of, distress which goes along with that loss. Yeah. COVID itself, the pandemic itself has been a huge bit of grief for many, many people because, what happens is people may have lost their livelihood, people may have lost their houses, people may have lost, moving from one part of the country to another part, people may have lost their, normal routine, even having a fresh breath of air going out without a mask is becoming a luxury now. Yeah. So there is a lot of losses there. And in addition, if you are losing a near and dear one, a family member, a friend, then that again becomes a great deal of distress. Yeah? Unfortunately, the ICDs and the DSMs do not consider grief as an important aspect. Of course, things are changing now, whereas in ICD-10, we only considered grief as somewhere, it was not even considered important. So when I did my MPhil training in Manipal, we thought of grief as just one little putty 2-mark answer, nothing beyond that, right? But now I know how important it is when I really work with grief, people who have gone through grief, and myself when I'm going through the grief. Yeah. So what we understand is that the grief is considered as a condition in which the person responds to a stressful event with extreme emotions, and which the actions can cause problems, socio-occupational problems. Yeah. There could also be psychosocial stressors which can impair socio-occupational functioning. And here, if you will read this statement very when you read the statement, it says usually a temporary condition that remits after new levels of adaptation are obtained and the stressors have been removed. So when it comes to a death of a near and dear one, how will that suffice?
Hello, ma'am.
If you say that you've lost, are you able to hear me?
Yeah, your slide is still on grief definition, and if you have moved, we can't see that.
Okay, so I think every time I need to stop share and then, okay. Is there a possibility of somebody helping me with the slide share? Then it becomes easier. I've already sent the slides to the group. So, so are you able to see me now?
Yeah, we can see you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, all right. Yeah, I will continue because I know what I need to speak till the PPTs get ready, right? Okay. So when we talk about grief, the definition in the ICD talks about when the stressor is removed. So does that mean a mother who's lost one of her child should be fine because she has another child? Can we say that? Or if a newly married couple loses their child, can we just tell as mental health professionals that, have another child, your grief is done. So if you lose a parent, what? If you lose a spouse, you get married again, you find another spouse, you find, is that the solution for grief? Okay, so that has been a huge question which was running in my mind. And then when I had the training with Kessler, this was one of the questions which we asked. And this is what was also asked during the support group. And when I present this to all my trainings, people really feel that is one of the things which we need to change in the classification. Yeah. So we also have to understand that there is a lot here which we need to understand when it comes to talking about grief. Yeah. We also have to understand that maladaptive reactions to psychosocial stressors occurring within a short time after the onset of the stressor. So can we say that grief has to manifest within one day? Grief cannot manifest after 3 months? Because if you look at it, grief can also be said as it can come a little while later. So there are times when you can have a delayed grief, you can have a prolonged grief. So does that mean the person who's going through that sadness, the feeling of bitterness, the feeling of anger, feeling of loss, after a few days, few weeks, few months is not grieving? I'm sure all of you know the answers, right? So, of course, now ICD-11 has approved, the WHO has approved a new diagnosis called the prolonged grief disorder. So, yeah, so we call the prolonged grief. Whenever you're ready, please share this as a PPT. Yeah. So, what happens is prolonged grief disorder also allows us to give us an idea of what could be considered as grief. And many times, people who come in for therapy also want the reassurance that they are going through grief. Recently, last week, I met somebody who lost her mother on January 25th. Not due to COVID, mother had cancer, but she was finding it very difficult because of COVID to take her for radiation and medical checkups, and because every time they have to find a driver, and the driver would not come because you have to take a not well person, and the driver is scared to go to the hospital, and you know how hospitals are. You have to wait there, get the radiation done. So every time there was a challenge. Okay. So the challenges of handling that was more challenging for her than, going through the grief of bereavement per se. Yeah. And it is very, very important that, after COVID, you talk to people who have lost their near and dear ones because of COVID. The first thing everyone says is, I wish I could just see his face or her face again. That's the first thing, because they are fully covered up. And the medical personnel tell, no, no, don't come near him, or don't come near the child, don't come near the person, near her, because, it's infected. But what would we all want to see? We want to see the face of your near and dear ones, at least last one time before the cremation happens or the burial happens. But it is not allowed. You are not even allowed to go near that person, pay your last rites, pray, nothing. You're just made to go along with the ambulance, not even go home, go along with the ambulance, finish the cremation. Of course, I understand that there is a lot in needs of precautions and contaminations and all of that. But are we also looking at human behavior? Are we also looking at human emotion? Because this is basic. Yeah? And we are all human beings here, and we all love our near and dear ones. Right? Something which was told to me was when I lost somebody very close to me was when my cousin came home to meet me. We were alone at home, my kids and me. She said, I wish I could just give you a hug. But no, she had to quarantine. So she could give me the hug after 7 days. But I wanted the hug then when I met her. Yeah? So you know how bad you can feel when, you just want somebody to be with you, but no. Of course, we have the virtual world, we have the phone calls, and we have all of that. But the pandemic has really changed dynamics to a large extent. Okay. And I strongly feel, of course, we need to keep the contaminations and the disease risk, all of that in mind. But as human beings, I think we also need to think of somewhere the physical touch, the social connect, the emotional connect is there. Yeah. I don't know what happened to the PPTs, but I will continue with the talk. I hope the audience is okay if I continue like this. Okay. So what we also understand is that grief can be a death of a pet, a dissolution of marriage, a moving from where you live to another place, significant loss in work. And here the isolation of grief becomes more because of the social isolation. And that's what I told you right now. Okay. So many times what happens is people also confuse grief and depression. People think that just because you're sad, people think that you're going into clinical depression. Absolutely no. The problem is when we start branding people that you can't be depressed, you can't be anxious, you just have to get along. That is where we find it very difficult. Yeah, we are also mental health professionals. We are also human beings. We also have a family. We also feel emotion, and that's what I would want all of you to look at. Yeah. So as we move ahead in the slide, whenever you are ready, I think all of you would also get my PPTs. So please go through the PPTs. I've given very detailed explanations of how we can distinguish or find a difference between what we call depression and what we call grief. There's also a bit of trauma because there is a lot of there could be people who may have emotionally or physically or verbally abused, and when the person loses that particular person who was the abuser, there is also a bit of happiness there. But then there is the guilt that, am I feeling happy because I lost this person? Or am I feeling sad that I've lost this person? So trauma can really confuse grief. Yeah? So the other day when I was talking to somebody who lost her husband, who is an alcoholic, he died because of COVID. And there were very mixed emotions in this young lady. She's about 33 and she's got a young baby. So she's worried on one side that, how am I going to manage with my young baby? And she's not very, she's educated, she's a graduate, but she's not very well placed. And with the pandemic, her job is kind of, on and off. So she's worried about financial aspects, but she's also somewhere relieved that the husband who is the abuser, physical abuser, verbal abuser, is not there. So she's confused whether she needs to grieve or be happy. And the in-laws feel that she's not grieving enough because there's also some bit of relief in her, and the in-laws don't like it. So there is that dynamics of, what do I tell my in-laws? Do I stay with my in-laws or do I come back to my mom's place? And if I come back to my mom's place, how am I going to manage? But if I stay in my in-laws' place, how am I going to manage? All these aspects are something which, not just the grief which we need to look at, all of these psychosocial interventions also are something which we need to talk about when it comes to grief therapy. Yeah. So as we move ahead, whenever you are ready with the PPTs, but I'm going ahead, we need to understand that DSM-5 has added this, and what we understand in DSM-5 as grief is it's an expectable, culturally approved response to a common stressor or loss, such as a death of a loved one, and it is not a mental disorder. So this is very, very rewarding because DSM does not consider grief as a mental disorder. It is a expected and culturally approved response, is what we say. Yeah. DSM-5 also talks about prolonged grief disorder, where they say the death of the person close to the bereaved is at least 12 months previously, and there has been grief response, where there is intense yearning and longing for the deceased person, and there's a lot of preoccupation with thoughts and memories, so that the person is constantly thinking, reminiscing about this person whom they've lost. As a result of the death, there are three major symptoms which DSM talks about. Feeling as though part of oneself has died, and this I hear from everyone. A young girl I met who lost her father 8 years back. She said, "After I lost my dad, I feel a part of me is dead. A part of me is missing, and I still yearn for that part." There can also be a marked sense of disbelief about the death. I cannot believe that this happened. How could this happen to my loved one? So there is a strong sense of disbelief. Avoidance of reminders, because most of the time we live with human beings, and these are human beings whom we love, and because we love these human beings, we also know that, yeah, thank you for that. We also know that if you could go down, I think I am in the am I audible? I hope the audience is able to see
Yeah,
my...
Dr. Keerthi, you're audible. We are just trying to figure out which slide you're on.
Okay, if you can keep going down, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
So whenever the audience is able to read my slides at home, please go through the tables. Yes, please go down one more. That's a DSM next. Yes, and one more. Yes, that's a Tin Man. Yes, and the next one. That's where I am. So I was talking to you about prolonged grief. The next one, please. Yes, that's the one I was talking about. So we are talking about identity disruption. We're talking about marked sense of disbelief. Can you also do slideshow, please? That's possible. We're also looking at intense emotional pain. So it can be sadness, it can be anger, it can be bitterness, it can be any of the unpleasant emotions. Okay. Difficulty to move along with life because we feel as if we are stuck there in that moment. Life goes on as quickly as possible, but we feel stuck there in the moment. Feeling that life is meaningless, there's nothing to look forward to. And there is a lot of numbness and loneliness which happens. Yeah? And the numbness and the loneliness is accentuated because of the social isolation due to the pandemic. Yeah? So we need to look at all of this as part of the grief, the prolonged grief. And if this happens immediately, after a few weeks, after the death of a near and dear one, then of course it's part of the grief. Can we go to next slide, please? So we also have to look at, it could be loss of a pet. So I'm having a few people who are coming in talking about death of a pet, and I have somebody who's lost her dog, and I'm seeing somebody who's lost her cat. She's living alone, so the cat was the major support system for her, and the cat was not well. So initially, even I wondered, how can loss of a cat be so, traumatic for her? But actually, it is the way she cries, the way she misses. It is really very saddening watching her. Yeah? So what happens is there is an analogy of the river in the wound given by David Kessler and Erica, who works a lot with adults who are grieving, and Erica who works a lot with adolescents who are grieving. So the analogy is, so if you have a river flowing, we are from Kerala, I'm also from Kerala, so I know we love water bodies. So when you see rivers moving ahead, you would want a free flowing river. So that is where a life would be normally. If there are certain, branches, small stones, or on the way of the river, that is something where the river is not able to move clearly. That is where David Kessler talks about as grief. But when there is a huge boulder, when there is a huge tree stopping, blocking the river's flow, that becomes prolonged grief. Something similar to what Erica talks about when we talk about prolonged grief. Is she says it looks like a wound, which is, if it is just a cut, it's more like a grief. But if it is an infectious wound more deep down, then it is more of a prolonged grief. Many times when we explain this to persons who are grieving, they are also able to understand why the grieving becomes more painful and hurting for them. Yeah? And it is 12 months post-death for adults and 6 months for children. The next slide, please. So what we also understand here is that mourning is very, very important when it comes to grieving. And we also need to look at, so the aspect here is to work through the pain of grief. We need to have little doses of the pain, embrace the pain so that we don't avoid or suppress it. And we remember the person through memories, through pictures, through videos. Of course, dreams too hold a large significant part there. So the gadgets are really helpful here, because there are times when people have said that, I could listen to my father's voice because I have recorded. I could listen to my child's voice. I could see my child playing. I could see my husband walking and talking to me, or my wife talking to me. And that's really nice, because I can still have those memories with me. Yeah. To adjust to life without the disease. So many times what happens is, when you, something for researchers, if I could request, when you are doing a research in that initial demographic details, please do not ask, unless it is really, really necessary, are you a married person, single, widow, widower, is it really necessary for the research? Then okay. But many research studies which send me these questionnaires, they will have about 100 pages, and these are things which are asked which would never connect to the main study. And I always find it difficult to understand, why is it that you would want to, unless you are looking at grief or anything connected to that, whether you want to write yourself as a widow or widower, or deceased person, something like that, right? Because it becomes very difficult for a parent to call themselves as a bereaved parent, a married woman to be calling herself as a widow. It is a strong, loaded term. So if you are calling somebody as, okay, you are a bereaved parent, or you are a widow, or you have, something like that, you've lost your sibling, then it becomes very difficult for them, even for that connotations, the designations. Okay, so we also need to be clear in our vocabulary as to what is it that we need to address. Because for that person who's lost somebody near one, it is a big loss. It's the loss of a human life. Okay, so mourning is also important when we have to maintain the connection to the deceased while moving on with life. So all of these studies are also available. So please go through these studies on the internet, on Google Scholar, it's available. Next slide, please. So we also need to understand that there are different stages, and all of us are familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who's one of the pioneers to talk about grief. David Kessler has worked with Kubler-Ross for a long time and written a lot of books on grief and grieving. He personally has lost his mother and his child, and that has helped him in the grieving. So I could connect very well when he was talking about his own personal journey of grief, and the support group, which talks about our personal group, personal journey of different losses we've had, is always very heartwarming, and the support system always supports and empowers. So what we understand here in Kubler-Ross is she's spoken about different stages. And what we also understand from reading Kubler-Ross and David Kessler is that, next slide please, the stages are never linear. So even though there are called as stages, it is not like Piaget or Erikson who talks about moving from one stage to the other stage. In grief, can you please go to the next slide? Yes, thank you. In grief, we don't go from denial to anger and then to bargaining. We can start with bargaining. We can start with anger. Okay, so I have seen people coming in and being so angry with themselves, talking about, if I had taken my dad to not to this hospital, to the other hospital, where the facilities for COVID was better, I could have saved him. And I know there's another person who talks about that particular hospital. I should have taken him to this particular hospital. So I know wherever you go, whatever has to happen is going to happen. But I don't say that at that point because we are still helping them to ventilate. So we've seen people moving from anger to maybe directly to acceptance. Maybe the denial continues for a long time. So we can't say it is always going to be in this stage. They can move from acceptance, coming back to bargaining. So many times the bargaining could be with God, with a higher superior power, maybe sometimes with their own family members, which is all done as a defense mechanism, helping the person to grieve and mourn better. Kessler, next slide. Kessler has added one more stage in this, and it is not linear again, and that stage is called meaning. So after we understand that, okay, we accept that we have lost somebody, then we start looking at the meaning of this life without this particular person. So we're not looking at meaning of why this person died, we're looking at what is the life because I've lost this particular person in my life. So we all talk about post-traumatic growth and not post-traumatic stress. We talk about post-traumatic growth. And that is where we look at finding gratitude that we had the time with this person. We have so many good memories with this person. And that person in my life has added so much value in my life. And that is what we are going to look at. And that really helps in the grieving process. We also understand, and this is exactly what this person who lost her dog told me, that, I understand the brevity and the value of life. I hope I'm still audible. I understand. Yeah, am I still audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I understand that, life has changed and life is still not what I used to be before I knew you, before you were there in my life. And life is going to change from here. However, it is again a decision where I would work towards finding meaning in this life. And that is what the mental health professional, along with the support system, helps the person who is grieving, the person who's lost someone is going to help. Yeah. Moving ahead. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah. So we also need to understand that in grief, there is also a lot of identities. The next slide. Yeah. So we need to look at different identities, different role changes, like how I was telling you. It's not moved to the next slide. Yeah. Different relationships with others. So I am working with a person who's lost her twin sister. Okay, we've kind of worked on the grief, and she was brought in because she was not willing to get married. But the actual reason why she didn't want to get married was the grief. So what we understood later on as we worked on was that she felt that if she gets married, she is being unfaithful to her twin sister. And people were just telling her that, forget your sister, you should move ahead. But it's so difficult. Her birthday is the same with her sister. Right? Her school is the same which she went with her sister. Her friends are the same. Even her, the password is her sister's name. So how do you expect her to forget? And her parents would talk about, you like putte? Your sister used to like idli. Things like that. So, it's so difficult even in normal conversations not to bring the sister. And how do you expect her to forget? Yeah, that is where the grief therapy works. Yeah? So first, when we start talking about grief, we also need to sensitize people that, just by giving invalidating statements that, just forget it, move ahead, go on with life, does not work. So in our vocabulary as mental health professionals, please do not use these terms as forget, move on, because this is really very, very hard for people who are, grieving. Next slide, please. So what we are looking now is, as I said earlier, the post-traumatic growth and not the stress. Yeah? Of course, we know that there is a trauma, there is a hard, sad period, but we need to move on. That's the dialectical aspect to it. And there's a lot of DBT which we use here during therapy and which really help, especially emotion regulation and all of that. Yeah. So this is something which I would want all of you to read. Some things cannot be fixed; they can only be carried. And this is a huge, huge thing which helped me. And this is from David Kessler, that your loved one's death is permanent, and that is so heartbreaking. And I believe your loss of hope can be temporary. Until you can find it, I will hold it for you. I have hope for you. I don't want to invalidate it. I also don't want to give death any more power than it already has. Death ends a life, but not our relationship, our love, and our hope. These are strong, strong statements. And of course, there are a lot of reading materials provided, lot of articles provided, which also helps the person to understand that grieving is a normal, natural process as one moves ahead in life. The next slide, please. So, whenever people, mental health professionals who are listening to me, please do go read books on grief, because grief is also there, and grief is also something to be worked on and supported. So what are the two main goals? Who are we without them, and establish a new relationship with them. Yeah? So we also have to look at, there is life beyond the death, and there is also a role of them in our lives. Yeah? The next slide, please. So what we need to look at is, this person had a lot of influence in my life, and this person is definitely going to influence throughout. So we would definitely think of, I would think, okay, what would my dad do at this instant? I'm still having connecting bonds with him. So that's one more theory we talk about when it is grief. So we don't think that, just because this person is not there physically, this person is always going to be with us in our memories and influencing our thoughts and opinions and decisions and all of that. And we also know, when you love somebody, we will definitely grieve for them, because the love is all powerful, and we can't be just living in this world without loving a family member or a friend or a pet or even a mentor for that matter. So when you respect a mentor, when you lose that person, that's grief. Okay. Many times, of course, we've also had people talking about and quoting scriptures and religious notes. And of course, many times it helps. We also have to look at whether, this is ideally required, appropriate at that point. And if it is, please make use of religious scriptures, the quotes, which you think would help that person. Yeah? Like how we have love bursts. So when you look at somebody whom you love the most, maybe your parent, a sibling, or your spouse, or boyfriend, girlfriend, somebody. So what we also see is, you can have a burst of love for them. Same way, you can have a burst of love for the deceased person. It can also add on to grief. Yeah. So there was this discussion we had in one of my previous trainings. One of them brought out this thing which was doing the rounds during the second pandemic, that grief is love, that is no way to go. And I just added that in the slide. And maybe end of the day, end of the session, I would want to listen from audience. What is your take on this? Grief is love, that is no way to go. I personally do not believe in that. Grief is love, of course, but it has the person whom we loved there. Maybe he or she is not physically present there, but nobody's stopping us from loving that person, and nobody's stopping us, and nobody can stop us from remembering that person or loving that person. Yeah. Love continues if you allow yourself to feel it, and you will find great meaning in it. Is there a timeline for grief? According to the classifications, there is. But personally, if you listen to David Kessler, there is no timeline. It can move on, it can be resolved earlier or faster or slower, or the adjectives don't work there. It is personal grief. Each person, like how we have fingerprints and eye prints and facial expressions, same way, each person has a different time frame for grief. And just because somebody moves ahead slower, somebody moves ahead faster, those adjectives don't work there. The next slide, please. So what we look at is, I will learn to live in the sunshine and not only the darkness of your shadow. These are different factors. This is from research studies again. What we understand is that the environment, so now the pandemic is a huge stressor which is influencing the meaning of the loss, because we do not have our near and dear ones coming. If somebody's not there with you, you would want them, their presence to be not just virtual but also physical along with you. The individual's age, so a young person. So recently, I think not recently, last year I met this boy who was in the 12th standard, and he was worried that he lost his dad, and the first thing he asked me was, I wanted to show my dad that I could get good marks, because there was always this argument with his dad that you're not studying, and he started studying. And then suddenly father had COVID, it became serious, and they took him to the hospital but couldn't save him. So what happened is the guilt that, did my dad lose hope because he saw me not studying? And I always wanted to study and show that I could get, at least 90% in my 12th. So that is what we are looking at. So age of the person, the personality, the background aspects to it, the support system. Yeah. Circumstances of the death and loss. So there's also this, study going on where we are looking at whether chronic loss, or meaning when you lose somebody due to Alzheimer's or due to cancer or a kidney disease, is more strenuous, stressful than if you lose somebody suddenly. I still don't have an answer. And the previous time when we had this discussion, many of them felt that this is not necessary because grief is grief, and I totally agree with that. Yeah, grief is grief. You've lost a person who's near and dear to you, and that's what is most matters. Relationship with the person, as I was telling you earlier, there can also be relief that you've lost this person, but it's always a baggage. There is always a combination of emotions, and that can create a lot of issues. So if we can go down, skip a little more. There's one particular slide, if you can just show me. If you can please go down. Yeah, I wanted all of you to read this. This was one of my posts and it went viral. A lot of people, this was when I was grieving on my highest level of grief, this came out. And this was really viral, and many people called me to say, people whom I didn't know also called me to say that, actually connected to them. Okay, so please see to it that we do not use terms like this. Many a times people do not come to a mental health professional for, immediate grief relief. But once we also know, it could be somebody, a neighbor or a family member, or somebody whom you know as a friend who's grieving, we also have to keep in mind that just by saying that be strong, your children need you, do not cry, is not going to help them in any way. What can we do? That's the next slide. Please, next slide. So what can we do? What can we do to help them? Is, I'm sorry for your loss. I don't know what to tell you, but I'm here to, be there with you. Even if you don't say anything, that's okay. But just be there. Yeah, even if you're not able to physically come, call up, send a message, check on how you are. How are you today? Really holds a strong meaning, because we are not looking at yesterday and tomorrow. We're looking mindfully today. How can I help you today? What would you like to talk about today? This is what we are looking at. And people who are watching, please look at this video given by Brené Brown talking about validation and silver lining. So many times people say that, you've lost one child and so what, you still have another child, you still have one parent. So somebody told me, so what, you still have one parent living. So what? Both my parents are equally important to me. Just because I've lost one person does not mean, compensated by the other person. Yeah, it is important that, we facilitate, we validate them with statements. If you do not know what to say, don't say anything. Just be there, and that presence is what we are looking at. Yeah. I will skip a few slides because we are talking about psychological assessments and it's readily available. Unfortunately, we don't have assessments which are standardized in India. So if the research department can look at grief questionnaires, tests available, if they can also standardize and develop tools based in India, that will be very, very helpful. Yeah. The next slide, please. Yeah, so we talk about self-care and self-compassion. I wanted to emphasize on this because as mental health professionals who are also frontline warriors, so I also work with nurses and frontline warriors. I myself am a frontline warrior where we had to work a lot with grieving families. And it is very, very difficult to tell a grieving member, a family member that you've lost somebody. And when a few of them came forward when they knew that I myself am a grieving person, and they said, I know you can understand what I'm going through because I heard that you lost a near one, which was very heartwarming for me because that's the empathy I'm looking at, and that's the empathy they are looking at. Yeah. So what we are looking at is importance of self-care. So many times, as we know, our mirror neurons and our empathy, when we know about compassion, we also know about compassion fatigue and burnout. So it's very, very essential as mental health professionals helping grieving persons, that we take care of ourselves. So the self-care, the self-compassion part, very, very important. So take care of your sleep, your hydration, your food intake, sleep, and if you believe in, maybe spirituality or a superpower, that it is a strong grounding force for you. And also look at a good work-life balance because now many things are going virtual. We also need to look at the 24-hour cycle where you can't be working 24 hours because the world has become smaller and smaller, and we can't be working more than what is stipulated us. Yeah. So we also have to be mindful about us as mental health professionals, and unless we do that with us, we can't prescribe that to people who are grieving. Yeah. And they do understand. So when I tell them that I need to spend time with my children because I've been working full day, so they understand. They say, okay, yes, I understand that, and I think we should have our session on looking at, and you definitely get that. Yeah. The next slide, please. I will quickly go. Can the organizers also tell me how much more time I have?
Ten more minutes, ma'am.
10 minutes. Okay, so I'll take about 2-3 more minutes and then we will have question answer because I'm really interested in discussions. Yes. So there is a lot of psychological therapies, and this is not all of it, but many of it which we use. Grief yoga, if you can Google for grief yoga, there's a lot on that. It is something like the yoga which we do here, but it is more connected to grief. Paul Denniston, if you can Google for Paul Denniston. If I had time, I could have demonstrated one of that, but there is, I think we have positive for time. But if you could Google for Paul Denniston, grief yoga, definitely a lot of help, which helps you to connect to the grieving person, and they themselves have told me that it is very helpful. Grief resolution therapy, support groups. There are a lot of support groups happening also in India and also all over the world. Kessler has very specific support groups. So if I've lost a twin, if I've lost a sibling, if I've lost a parent, so for each single grieving individual, there is a support group. But we have not reached to that level in India. But if possible, mental health professionals, this is my request that if you could all work on that and develop more and more support group systems, that is really, really going to help the whole of humankind. There's a lot of self-care necessary, and there's a lot of other therapies which we can use, ACT and CBT, and a lot from DBT where I use, which really helps in handling grief. The next slide, if we can quickly move on to, I don't think we'll have time for cognitive challenges. The next slide, that shows the tier. So the task of grief is to accept the reality of loss, experience the pain of loss, adjust to the new environment without the lost person, and reinvest in the new reality. So that's what we are looking at TEAR as an acronym, and we finally look at meaning of life. Yeah. So moving ahead, can you please go to the next slide and the next slide? So, and my request to all participants is whenever you get time today, please go through the slides, because there's a lot of hard work, lot of research I've put in behind the slides. And the next slide, please, if you can, because it gives you a lot of understanding of grief, and it allows you to take grief forward. Yeah. So 7 healing questions. So my request to participants here is, if you could look at one of them and take one of them as a question which helped you, if you are a grieving person, or somebody whom you have in mind who is a grieving person. One of them, and we can discuss that during the discussion. I have more questions in this 7 healing questions, and then I have more questions other than the healing questions. So this is from the SFBP model. The next slide, if people have read through this. Yes. So all of this I've seen have helped people. I've seen people, you know, really. So we look at what could be the best possible question, and we brainstorm during the group support therapy, and then we help each other. Really, really works. Yeah. If you have read through this, please go to the next slide. Yeah. If you can quickly go through the questions, it really helps, and it really helps also in your therapy sessions, in your clinic or hospital or your chamber where you meet people, or in the support group. Any one question which you think is interesting, relevant, and then one more slide. We have one more slide before I wind up. Yeah. So that's my bibliotherapy. So many people have read through these books, and there's a lot of research support. There's a lot of research articles provided, and there's one more slide on that. The next slide, please. There's a lot of research and articles, and option B personally has helped me a lot. So I've just put that as a something which I liked most, but doesn't mean that other books are not as good. But of course, there are more and more. The reference books itself would be like 30 slides, so I don't want to put all of them, but it's all available, and it's please to read, because it allows people to understand grief better. Take it to grassroots levels. When I work with urban population and rural population, we've all seen that grief is grief. There is no difference in a person who's coming to meet me in a Mercedes and a person who's coming in the metro or in the cycle. So grief is always grief. The next slide, and that's about my support system. The next slide, that is where we in Element Edge are a group of women, all psychologists and the clinical psychologists here, and we have an organizational marine psychologist, we have counseling psychologists, school psychologists. So that's my team who has been my support system, along with my family and extended family. And two of us in this group were grieving, and there was a lot which we did for each other, and there was a lot of progress and growth happening there. Yeah. And the last slide is from Winnie the Pooh, which will be my take-home message. So I am sure all of you know Winnie the Pooh. That's a cartoon. And what Winnie says is that if ever there is a tomorrow when we are not together, there is something you must always remember. You are braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, smarter than you think. But the most important thing is, even if we are apart, I will always be with you. And every time I read that, I get goosebumps. Yeah. And we do this. We also tell people to, this was sent to me by somebody who was grieving, and she said, this would really help me. And I said, yes, this is also helping me. So I'm going to use this. Yeah. So that is where we would stop about grief. My request to all of you is, Consider grief, especially during the pandemic, is very important. It is a pandemic by itself, the grief. And as mental health professionals, there is a strong, important, significant role we can play while taking grief further. Yeah. So can we please stop screen share? And I would love to listen to your discussions and thoughts and observations.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Gracious of you to speak so eloquently about a difficult topic. So now, let's move on to some questions and answers. Yes, it's time for the question and answer sessions. So participants, please feel free to break your questions and doubts on the comment box and the chat box.
Hello. Keerthi ma'am, I'll read some questions for you so that it will be easy for you to answer.
That will be helpful. Yeah. Is this Bayana?
Yes,
May I
ma'am.
know your name?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, hi Bayana. Yes.
I have added some one of my experience.
Yes, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so are you reading the question?
Ma'am, I'll read. Yes, ma'am.
yes,
During
please. Yeah, when
COVID
it's easier.
telecounseling, it would be one of the worst experiences if the person we are calling is no more. If their family members answer the call, we have to handle the grief of family members where they have no shoulders to provide physical support, as relatives and neighbors will not visit the house in the morning because they are afraid of getting infected.
Absolutely. That's a great observation. Yes. Because we've had people delivering couriers from Amazon and from colleges sending them admission forms, and the poor child is no more. Okay, so we've recently been discussing a parent because he had applied for Oxford and he got through, but the child is no more. Child as in, the 19-year-old, he wanted to go there, he got this scholarship, he got everything, but he's not there. Yeah, which was very, very difficult. I still can remember them sitting here. If possible, if you can also see this behind me, can you all read the picture and what is written? That was made for me specially by this person who lost a dog. So what is written is, just when the caterpillar thought the world was ending, she became a butterfly. Okay, so that was made by all of us, but she's the one who spearheaded it and said, I want to put this as a memory in the clinic. Then we have lots more around, but I'm not able to show you around. So we do artwork in the clinic as support group. Yeah, okay. Questions?
Okay, ma'am. Next question. Sometimes clients come up with the expectation that the therapist will sweep away all the painful emotions associated with grieving. So to what extent it is difficult for a therapist to socialize the client about the management framework or grief therapy, and how do you do that?
Right, that's a very important question for asking that. So when a person is referred or when a person comes in for grief therapy, we don't start on grief therapy on day one, like how we wouldn't start any kind of therapy on as soon as they come in, right? We would first talk to them, build a rapport, understand what the problem is, then prime them about whatever is necessary in grief, and let them understand that as a therapist, as a mental health professional, I understand what you're going through, right? So only then we move on, because we also give them a reality check where they also understand that, we are not fixing a problem because there is no problem. You've lost somebody and that's a genuine reason for feeling bad. We're not here to, break or mend a machine or something which is broken, because there's no repair work happening here. We are together as human beings helping, facilitating the grieving process. When you also help them in that reality check, people are able to be grounded and they are willing to come back for sessions. Yeah. Also, I tell them that, when you come, we need to come back for a few sessions because the grief is there, and you've known this person for so long, and you can't just expect to forget and move ahead. That also is a very strong statement, because they also understand that we are not telling them, or we are not prescribing that you need to just move on. Okay, we are providing that safe place, the validation, like how we would do in DBT, the 6 levels, the validation, the levels of support, which is definitely therapeutic. Yeah, and that would allow the person to come back for therapy, move ahead in the process of therapy. Yeah.
Okay.
I hope I've answered that question.
Yes, ma'am. Another question is that sometimes clients are really confused about their own grief reactions, because sometimes they tend to equate experience of grief or stopping, the grief experience with a kind of forgetting or not loving the other person, or something like, if I'm not grieving enough, then it's like I'm forgetting the person, I'm not showing the love and care whatever I received from the person after his death. So in such cases, how the usual grief therapy approach would be different?
Yes. So we need to understand that that's where the cognitive work comes. So, maybe later on, if we have more detailed discussions, we can definitely bring in the cognitive aspect. And this is many people have told me that, if I work through grief, do you mean to say that I'll forget the person? Or if I am not thinking of this particular person, does that mean that I am not grieving enough? Or does that mean I am unfaithful? So there was a wife who told me that, I am not so sad, and I'm now, after the grief therapy, a few sessions, I'm now thinking of taking care of my child and focusing more on the child. So her parents were very happy that she's now focusing more on the child and looking at getting back to work and all of that, right? But she was also worried that, am I being unfaithful to my husband because I'm not all the time thinking about him? Okay, so that's again a cognitive error which we need to work on. So we would not directly, aggressively challenge. We would go gently looking at different ways of challenging, so that the person can be reality oriented and not be so aggressive on themselves. Yeah. So it is also the gentleness, the genuineness, the reassurance, the validation, all of it which would envisage in a grief therapy. Yeah, all right.
Hello, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, Dr.
Yeah. First of all, it was a very informative session, and you've presented this area is a generally less discussed area. But ma'am, my question to you is: recently, I lost a relative, and she has 2 children, one a son of 14 years and a daughter of 8 years. So, being a relative from a psychology background, my relatives were asking me to speak to the children. But I was totally clueless as to what to tell them when they lost their mother. And it was all of a sudden event, because till a day before they have seen their mom, and everything happened in just one day. So they were all expecting the mother to come back home, after she was all well from hospital. But unfortunately, the things turned other way around, and we lost her. So what to do in such kind of situations, especially when we are, in a situation where we have to talk to children of the school age? Thank you, ma'am.
Right. Thank you for that question. Children and adolescents itself is a huge population which we talk about, especially when it comes to grieving, and we can never equate the grief which a child is going through to be similar to what an adult is going through, because definitely the cognitive processes, the reasoning skills are all different, right? And especially when the child has lost somebody who's very near, like a parent, it becomes very difficult for the child. Okay? And as mental health professionals, what we usually look at is, we're not going there to just solve the problem. We are going there to help facilitate the grief process. Okay. So as I said earlier, we're not going there to just repair or fix it. We are going there to be supportive as and the psychological skills which we have of rapport building, paraphrasing, validating, generating more hope. All of this is going to be playing a huge role when it comes to helping near and dear one who is grieving, because we have developed all of that empathy factors, and that is what we would need to bring in for the child when we are talking to a child. Okay, so my suggestion would be go there with an open heart, listen to what they have to say, and many times that safe place where they can just talk about what it is gives them a lot of solace. Okay. Maybe if they're coming back later for more sessions, then we also talk about the empty chair, we talk about writing a letter, we talk about bringing back memories. So there are times when people have brought albums into the clinic and we've sat together, spoke about this child, this person whom I'm telling who lost her twin. She brought in like pictures on her phone, and they were like pictures and pictures. And we sat together with her mother and father, and it was very sad because, I had tears, but it was very cathartic for them. Yeah. And that is what we are looking at. Yeah. There was this, I can also quote you, there's this young girl whom I'm seeing, she's only in the 10th. She lost her dad 3 years back, not because of COVID. They were all playing in the swimming pool. He had a heart attack in the swimming pool and he died. And they still thought he's playing behind. And they were like, Dad, watch the ball. But he's not there. So the guilt was for this girl is that she pulled him into the pool. Yeah. And they always do that. It's not that, the first time, but they've always played in the pool before also. Okay. But the guilt was that I called my dad to play in the pool and I made it, I killed him. Okay. Which was a cognitive error, which, as mental health professionals, we know that. So that was something we had to, work on. And now she understands that there's no point in feeling guilty about it. Okay. And as I said, the initial few sessions were just talking, allowing her to talk about it. And then she brought pictures of her dad and videos they had. And we also worked with the mother because she is a grieving wife, right? We also had to work with the mother and with this particular girl. So then she brought in a pen which her dad used to use, and she said, this is what I'm going to keep for my life, and this is always going to be with me. Yeah? And now she's, of course, she's adopted a kitten, and she's given him a Korean name, which I can't say because I don't know what the name is. It's like one Ta Poom Beam or something. Or people who follow Korean series would know that. So that's what we are looking at, moving ahead in life.
Okay, ma'am. There are two more questions in the chat box. One is, what should teachers do when their students come to them for such things which can be categorized as grief? Do you think recommending them to go to doctor will be okay, or a teacher should talk to them first and try to figure out their problems in detail? That is the first question. And the second one is the difference between grief and depression. Are they same, or what is the difference?
Okay, thank you for the questions. I think the first one is from Suchitra. I don't know whether you are a teacher or a professor, but if you are looking at teachers as mental health professionals who are psychologists who are teaching you, is of course as mental health professionals who have completed your training in psychology, you have all the skills to manage a person who is grieving. You also are, equally ready to help a child or an adult. But if you feel that the person needs more intense clinical interventions, then please refer to a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist who is trained in grief therapy, so that you are facilitating the grieving process. Of course, talk to the person, find out to what level they are, how intense the emotions are. Is there a self-harm thought in them? Are they also looking at, anger, aggression, all of that, so that, we gauge the severity of the situation and then move ahead. And also that would also provide them that, as a teacher, they have a person who is genuinely interested in helping them. Yeah. Grief and depression is definitely not the same. There are a lot of coloring happening. There's a lot of symptoms of depression which can come in grief, but depression per se cannot be always grief. So symptoms of depression can happen in grief, but depression can happen by itself otherwise. So you don't have to lose somebody to go into depression. But in grief, that is one of the major aspects which we look at. So either you lose something or lose someone, you move away, things like that, which would say that you are going through grief. So if you could also look through my slides, that's one of the slides which I was not able to present at that point, but you all would get you all would get the slides, so please read through that. Yeah.
Yes, that's it. And we have received no further questions. So thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Keerthi, ma'am. Thanks for sharing some extremely valuable knowledge on grief and its management during the pandemic, which was something new for most of us. And with this, we have come to an end to the day one of our seminar. Thank you, everyone, for being with us on our first day.
Thank you very much. Is it okay if I leave the meeting?
Sure, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, everyone. So tomorrow's session will start as per the schedule. The morning session will begin with the keynote address by Dr. Kamala Ram Mohan on the title, COVID-19, A Perspective from the Frontline. Then we'll have an invited panel session titled